Hello and welcome to The Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Anyekolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, the reggae music legend Bunny Wailer, one of the music genre's most important voices, has died in Jamaica at the age of 73. He was the last surviving member of the famous international group the Wailers, which also included Bob Marley and Peter Tosh. Together, they achieved international fame with such classic hits as Simmer Down and Stir It Up. Bunny Wailer went on to win 3 Grammys and was given Jamaica's highest honor, the Order of Merit. Tributes have been pouring in from around the world, with fans and fellow musicians describing him as a legend. The life of Bunny Wailer, one of reggae music's most important voices, in a moment. And later, the press freedom group Reporters Without Borders files a criminal complaint in a German court against Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, accusing the Saudi heir of crimes against humanity. The complaint centers on what it calls the widespread and systematic persecution of journalists in Saudi Arabia, including the assassination of the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. We'll speak to the head of the legal department at Reporters Without Borders coming up. Now this week, Jamaica and reggae music lovers around the world are in deep mourning. Neville O'Reilly Livingston, better known as Bunny Wailer, or more affectionately as Jar B, was the youngest of the 3 original Wailers. He played with Bob Marley as a child, and later his father lived with Bob Marley's mother, so they were sort of stepbrothers. Peter Tosh, the 3rd Wailer, had a son with one of Bunny's sisters. Bunny set up the Wailing Wailers, as it was first called, in 1963. The band lasted 10 years, and he was to play a key part in creating the group's distinctive harmonies. Along the way, Bunny Wailer picked up 3 Grammys, and in 2017 he received the Jamaican government's Order of Merit for his contribution to Jamaican music. Well, in a moment, we'll look back at Bunny Wailer's remarkable life. But first, here's a brief retrospective about the man and his music, along with his contemporaries Peter Tosh and Bob Marley.
We used to call ourselves juveniles. Brothers in the ghetto, where we used to go to rehearse, say, you come from a wailing environment where people always bawling and beg, you should be named the Wailers. I was inspired of the divine and by and through the divine inspirator. So these songs are eternal. They're not something that you'd ever get tired of listening, because it is bringing to you all the things that you would want to hear in a song. Robert Marley, we were friends before we started singing. You know, we lived in St. Anne, and he was 9 and I was 7, and that was a long time before we began the Wailers. There was a recruitment process taking place. Myself and Robert started to put the group together, and then here comes this tall, dark, as they would say, handsome dude named Peter, and he has this guitar knowledge. And from Robbie here, that Robbie said, play guitar? You serious? So he just give him the guitar right away. So it's 4-string still, but Peter tuned the 4-string, and it's just like that. It's our business to steer it. Ooh, yeah. It was an exciting time, you know. It was because we were friends, you know. We didn't record that song for money or for any making of any profits. Randy's loved the song and he wanted the Wailers to sing the song on his label, and we just did that. You know, that's the experiment of the Wailers. We always try to make something that was never made before. And that's what we are like, the Wailers. I'm sorry that we are not seeing Brother Bob physically and Brother Peter physically, but in Bunny Wailer rests the other two brothers, you know, and so the Wailers are forever a family. As I, Bunny Wailer, I'm still here doing what is family-like for the Wailers.
And sadly, he is no longer here. Well, for more on the life of Bunny Wailer, we hope to be joined in a moment from Baltimore, Maryland by Elbert Stewart, an original member of the Jamaican group The Cables, who grew up with Bunny Wailer. And here in the studio, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined now by the Jamaican, Nigerian international journalist and African diaspora analyst Lindsay Barrett, who wrote prolifically about the original Wailers, including Peter Tosh, Bob Marley, and of course Bunny Wailer. Thank you ever so much. Absolutely delightful to see you. Although you're beginning to look a bit like Moses now. Or at least my impression of what Moses would look like with that sort of, you know, storm of hair around your face.
Well, you know, we said Christ was never a bald-headed man, as we said in Jamaica, and that era is going. Bunny Wailer is just the latest of a number of key figures from that era. There was last year Prince Miller, Count Prince Miller, and then just recently Hugh Roy, the master of
everybody
toasting.
knows Hugh Roy, man.
And now Bunny Wailer. But it was a specific era and a very special era in Jamaica. I was a young man. I was actually the entertainment writer for the Star newspaper when it all started. So before I ran away from Jamaica, I worked
I like that you ran
with
away.
them. Well, I did run away, and I worked with these. Most of these young men were lucky to have the sound system movement coming up at that time. Count Reed's, there was a famous sound system master called Count Reed, who paid them to put music into his system. And it's very interesting. I've just recently been told that there's a new documentary about that era done by the Chin brothers. These were Jamaican Chinese brothers.
I know about them, yes.
Who started the movement before Chris Blackwell. Chris Blackwell, of course, of Island Records. In fact, just last week, I had a message from him reminding me that he was still around.
And of course, you have to say that Chris Blackwell is probably one of the people most responsible for making reggae music.
And Bob Marley.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Bob Marley obviously played the music, yes, but Chris Blackwell marketed the music.
He really marketed it well and in a very special way. And Chris is today about 86 years old.
That's extraordinary.
Also,
that is absolutely extraordinary.
Just last week, I had a message saying that Chris was still around and still remembered me. So I sent him a message to remind him that I wrote, my last column in Jamaica was about him. I wrote in the Star to say that he was going to make our music world music.
And he did.
And he did.
And I have to say that you yourself are a legend. And hopefully, before we finish this program, we'll talk a little bit about your own career and how it's evolved.
I was very happy to hear what is happening over Khashoggi's death.
Yes.
I wouldn't mind talking to you.
Sure, but I mean, let's focus on the Wailers generally, and of course Bunny Wailer in particular, because I mean you're in a better position to tell us about this. They've been described as the Jamaican version of the Beatles, so to speak.
They were definitely a bit more than that. Most interestingly, the Wailers' music was Rasta music. It took the early reggae, the early ska.
Yes, it was rock steady and ska. But
Yes.
they actually evolved reggae. didn't they?
And Bob and Bunny and Peter became philosophers. Strangely enough, these three very young ghetto boys just started to speak the wishes of the people of Jamaica.
Yes, I want to come to that because, I mean, this is a systematic discussion, and that is an absolutely critical element in this. So as they say in Nigeria, I want to lick the corners of the soup first before we get to the center part. So basically, Bunny Wailer, Peter Tosh, and Bob Marley helped spread the gospel, which is in part what you're saying, of reggae music to the far corners of the earth.
They spread black nationalism from the Jamaican point of view in a way that was unprecedented, because they were making young people who were just thinking of dancing think of something more than dancing.
But isn't it astonishing that an island as small as Jamaica, with less than 2 million people, had such a dramatic impact on the entire black world, not just in terms of the power of the music, because obviously it wasn't just reggae, you had, ska, you had rock steady, even calypso, although it's seen as
the early calypso type music that we had, which is mento,
yes,
is the music that really influenced the Wailers.
But then they
the
took all
Wailers
that.
brought the patois
Yes.
intonation into the music much stronger than we expected.
And here they took all of that, and politicized it to the point where it became, I mean, you couldn't listen to the music on its own. There was always a message in it.
That was
revolutionary message.
That was the point. And I can't really understand what drove the three of them and made
in that direction.
But it became obviously what they were about.
And of course, it influenced a whole slew of other Jamaican artists and international artists. I mean, people like Sonny Okosun in Nigeria,
yes,
who started seeing even Fela Kuti. I mean, they were all influenced to a greater or larger extent by that sense of social justice.
Yes.
Absolutely remarkable.
Absolutely.
Absolutely remarkable. We're going to take a break, Lindsay, but I want to say again that it's an absolute delight to have you in the studio. And I'll try not to call you Moses or Abraham. Stay with us. You're watching The Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we remember Bunny Wailer, one of the founders of reggae music, who's died at the age of 73. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Arise interview. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Bunny Wailer, the last surviving original member of Bob Marley and the Wailers, has died at the age of 73. The reggae music legend, who was also Bob Marley's stepbrother, helped shape their signature sound and particularly its close harmonies. Together with Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, they released hit after hit, taking reggae music to millions of fans in Africa, Europe, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific, and finding fame across the globe. The immediate cause of Bunny Wailer's death is unknown, but he had been in hospital since having a stroke in July last year. Tributes have been pouring in from around the world, with the musician Shaggy describing his death as one of the lowest moments in the history of music culture. Take a listen to this monster solo hit by Bunny Wailer called Cool Runnings. the astonishingly effulgent Bunny Wailer. And joining me in a moment from Baltimore, Maryland, he's still fiddling with his equipment, so hopefully he'll get it sorted, Elbert Stewart, an original member of the Jamaican group The Cables, who grew up with Bunny Wailer. He'll be joining us hopefully before the end of the program. And with me here in the studio, the Jamaican, Nigerian, international journalist and African diaspora analyst Lindsay Barrett, who wrote extensively about the original Wailers, Peter Tosh, Bob Marley and Bunny Wailer, and also wrote about the man who marketed a lot of their music, Chris Blackwell. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And in terms of how they each came to their end, Bob Marley died of cancer in 1981. Peter Tosh was shot and killed in his home in 1987. So Bunny Wailer was the only one from the original group that was alive and was always there, wasn't he? So, I mean, for him to pass on now is truly, as you said, the end of an era.
Yes, it certainly is, and it reminds us that although Jamaica is now an iconic musical center with dancehall and all that, how this came about was that the locals in Jamaica, the local sound system movement was on. And then we had a very buoyant entertainment culture. There was a gentleman whose name was Vere Jones. And then there was another one, Stephen Hill. Stephen Hill is actually from a very illustrious Jamaican political family. They were international promoters. They used to promote rock and roll, bring in stars from America, and then they would have Jamaicans.
North American music.
Yes, and they would have Jamaicans doing, you know, the backup on the show and so on. And a lot of these young Jamaican musicians at that time just didn't see why they couldn't do what the Americans did. And that was what gave them the confidence to really do something like what became Bob Marley and the Wailers.
But I mean, was there also, in addition to that, you talked about the culture of entertainment that prevailed in Jamaica at the time. Did that evolve out of the fact that the country was a very touristy country and therefore there was the need to entertain people who came, or did it come from that background of, you know, first slavery and then colonialism?
I think it's a mixture of both.
Right.
Yes, people were performers because they wanted to satisfy the visitors. Yes, that is very true. But we developed very much our own vision of what people should see and think of us. And the Jamaican music, as I remember it, starting from our calypso bass, which was called Mento, was always a music talking about ourselves. It was always, Jamaicans were always selling themselves, and not just to visitors, but to themselves. And that is how you notice the Wailers' music tells you something unique, tells you about something unique. Remember that Peter Tosh was the man who did Legalize It.
Oh, yes. And in terms of that, you know, that brings me to the contribution each of them made to the band, what they brought to it. I mean, Bob Marley was considered the poet. Peter Tosh was a brilliant guitarist as well as a singer, a militant Rasta, so he brought that militancy to it, which is, I think, informed the lyrics a lot. And of course, Bunny Wailer brought the two of them together. So you could say he was the middle ground.
Bunny Wailer was a harmony.
Yes.
He was a musician.
Yes.
His spirit was all music.
So he fused these two men. He was a singer, as you said, a percussionist, a songwriter. So in a sense, he had the talent of both Marley and Tosh.
That's true. That's very very, I didn't think of it that way, but that's really what he stood for. He could keep them together. You know, an interesting thing is that the three of them were friends, and they were always quarreling.
Well, it always happens, doesn't it?
It always happens. Them well. I remember them, they were very young when I left home.
Yes.
And they were, at that time, they weren't yet playing, but they used to come around.
It was a small country, wasn't it?
Yes, well, you know, we say we're little, but we tell our, we are small, but we are strong.
Small but mighty.
You know. But
and did you grow up in Kingston or somewhere else?
I grew up all over Jamaica, partly in Kingston, partly in Mavis Bank up in the St. Andrew Hills, partly in Brownstown, partly in Chapelton, in Clarendon.
I know Clarendon. That's where Peter Tosh, I think that's where Peter Tosh
is
from
Clarendon,
yes.
I moved all over Jamaica. My father liked the idea of us knowing everything we could as soon as possible. Every long vac when he was home, he carried us all over the place. And when I was growing up, the music was just coming out of the local.
Okay, let me ask you to hold that. We'll come straight back to it. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our remembrance of Bunny Wailer, one of the founders of reggae music who's died at the age of 73. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Now, one of the legendary figures of reggae music has died. Bunny Livingston, known as Bunny Wailer, founded the original Wailers with his childhood friends Bob Marley and Peter Tosh. And of course, they went on to become the band that took Jamaican reggae around the world. They truly are music royalty in a country where music means so much. And so Jamaica is in deep mourning this week over the passing of the brilliant Bunny Wailer. The music of Bunny Wailer. And to Jamaicans who know Bunny Wailer and who have tracked the history and evolution of reggae music, now with me, one of them joining me from Baltimore, Maryland, Elbert Stewart, an original member of the Jamaican group The Cables, who grew up with Bunny Wailer, and with me in the studio, the Jamaican Nigerian international journalist and African diaspora analyst, Lindsay Barrett. And let's go to Baltimore there. We were unable to get you on the video on WebEx, Mr. Elbert, but I'm glad that we're able to get you on the phone because I know this is important to you. You knew Bunny Wailer, didn't you?
Man, that's my good friend, man. We were close because he was living in Jonestown. I live in Jonestown and he live in Trenchtown. And Jonestown and Trenchtown, if you hear the history, those are giants. They're giants. So a lot of artists come from that area. Trenchtown, Jonestown, Joe Higgs, and Bob Mandy, Peter Patch, all of the artists come from the same little area there, you know. So we all was together. Even my wife used to work with them, do some work, they work like, you know. So we close, man. We were good, man. And Benny he was the one who the strictest one in the group, you know. He always liked everything to be outspoken, well, you know. But man, we miss a legend, man. We miss, man, and I say we just miss the
Yes, well, I mean, absolutely, he touched a lot of people around the world, including people here in Nigeria, in the UK, the United States, and so on. The tributes pouring in from everywhere. But one of the reasons we're very happy to talk with you is because you yourself were one of the originals, because when the Wailers began, there really was no reggae, was there? I mean, there was ska and rock steady, which people like you played, but no reggae. I mean, how did they ride that and take it out to the world?
Because let me tell you something. It was coming from, we call it kete, because we was playing kete, from kete to reggae. But we have the ska coming, and Bob Marley and the Wailers, they sing a lot of, I wouldn't even say Bob Marley Wailers. I'm talking about the Wailers. For before that, it was just the Wailers. And you have like Brathwaite used to sing song with them, and you have some lady, I don't quite remember their name, it's so long. And they were doing a lot of ska, you know. And those days, we never record, because those guys will give us a lot of inspiration, because they were doing a lot of song, all even they sing a song about what new pussycat, whoa, 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 whoa. Yeah, lot of sing, and you know, they used to around and used to go amongst them, and they
okay, I don't mean to interrupt you, Elbert, but I mean, unfortunately your line is not brilliant, so let me just ask you, how will you remember Bunny Wailer and of course the original Wailers?
Well, they were unique, and they were good people. Harry helped out a lot of people in every other way where they could help them. You know, on tour, you have a lot of musicians we always bring on tour, you know, and man, you do so many things, man, so it's more than tongue can tell, man, you know, so.
I want to thank you very much indeed. I wish we could have got you on your WebEx. That would have made the chat much more interesting, because we would have been able to see you, but sadly not. But Elbert Stewart talking to me there from Baltimore, Maryland, and he's an original member of the Jamaican group The Cables, and he grew up with Bunny Wailer. And of course, with me still in the studio is the international journalist, Lindsay Barrett, who is also an African diaspora analyst, and of course is himself of Jamaican origin. And before we went on the last break, Lindsay, you were talking about the 70s and how a lot of the Jamaican musicians out of places like Trench Town were becoming more conscious. So they started to shed that sort of North American look, because you mentioned that a lot of the North Americans were coming in and they were supporting them as sort of backing bands and so on. But they started to shed that look of suits and you know, the low haircut and all of that, opting instead for the more militant looking sort of attire. And of course they changed their tune as well.
Yes, and certainly they stamped Jamaica on the world. It became known that the Jamaicans were not just singing music, they were living music. And one of the things that brought that about was Bob's good friend Jimmy Cliff. You know, Jimmy Cliff
was very popular in Nigeria.
Very popular all over the world.
Yeah.
And he was a balladist. He really sang ballads, but in a Jamaican flair. And then, you know, they made the film, The Harder They Come.
I saw that movie.
That incredible movie.
Yes, I saw it.
Perry Hensel, a white Jamaican, was the director. And suddenly, people knew what Jamaica stood for. Many of us left Jamaica to carry the message, because Jamaica was one of the most African, Afrocentric nations in the world. The Rastafarians, whose Buru music, we used to call it Buru music in those days, that they played with rhythm, mostly rhythm and voice harmonization. Bob Marley, Bunny Wailer, Peter Tosh carried that spirit to the world. And now the era is over, but the music will live on.
But that's an important statement, because of course that's what helps to popularize and internationalize the music. The fact that there was a message in the music, there was a spiritual message, and they were speaking to the masses and giving a voice to the voiceless, so to speak.
Yes, and Bunny Wailer has a very important part to play in that, and that's why I'm so happy to hear that the Jamaicans finally decided to give him the Order of Merit, because he was, you know, they were young men, always Peter Tosh and Bob would quarrel. Bunny was always the one that could bring them together.
But would you say that initially they were outcasts because what they were doing went against the conventional grain in Jamaica?
Well, most great Jamaican musicians started off or somehow grew up to become unusual members of society. I'll tell you, if you, no matter how far you go back, but eventually we had a great Jamaican lady. Her name was Louise Bennett. Call her Miss Lou. She ended up being the icon of Jamaican culture, and most Jamaican musicians were eventually, they were either somewhat on the outside but greatly part of the inside. That has been Jamaica's real spirit.
And so just
that's the soul of Jamaica. That even if you are outside, if you are an outcast, people will listen to you.
Sure. And of course, you know, here they were evolving through music, politics, religion, because obviously Rastafari was their religion. But then they split in 1974. The group finally split apart. But 1976 was an extraordinary year for the three Wailers, wasn't it? Because each of them released a seminal album. Peter Tosh released Legalize It, as you mentioned earlier. Bob Marley released Rastaman Vibration, while Bunny Wailer released Black Heart Man. And all of them did astonishingly well, didn't they?
And each one told the story of the Jamaican youth.
But in a different way.
But of Jamaican youth who were determined to be their own persons.
And of course, Bunny Wailer kept going and picked up, I mean, apart from that, he survived after the other two died. I mean, he picked up 3 Grammys in the process. So he was still treading that path and spreading the message of reggae music, never wavering, and always, as one guy put it, putting his shoulder to the wheel.
In a way, it's a remarkable thing. It's a remarkable part of Jamaican history that I hope will go down as a historic and iconic moment in history. One of the important things we have to remember is that they were all inspired by things in Jamaican history. They were inspired by Garveyism. Marcus Garvey was, for them,
absolutely,
you know,
gospel.
And yet, at the same time, they were inspired by Rastafarianism, but from a different angle of, say, the average Rastaman.
Yes.
You know, Bob Marley became the anthem builder.
The Pope, if you like, the pontiff of sort of.
So it's a remarkable thing to think that we all came up with something to look back to and something to build on.
And we've got about a minute or so left. Bunny Wailer, of course, dead this week. His death reverberating around the world with tributes pouring in from the likes of Shaggy, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, the Jamaican Prime Minister, or all the rest of
it. His death was on your rival CNN this morning. Took me entirely by surprise.
Yeah, but in the last few seconds that we've got, how will you remember Bunny Wailer?
Well, the problem is I left Jamaica when people like Bunny were just joining the scene. And I met him once with Count Prince Miller. He was in Count Prince Miller's band as a percussionist.
Right, okay.
But
so you will cherish that memory?
Yes, I do. And what I remember about those three young men is that...
Very briefly, we're out of time.
They were coming into the music.
Okay. Lindsay, thank you very much indeed. Lindsay Barrett, you're watching The Arise interview.